In the scorched heart of Red Creek, a place where the desert wind didn't just carry dust, it carried secrets. A young widow named Clara Benson was about to make a deal with the devil. She just didn't know it yet. She thought she was marrying a rich old rancher for a life of comfort, a life of safety. But in the Old West, safety is an illusion, and comfort always comes with a price. What she found behind the walls of his sprawling mansion wasn't a paradise. It was a tomb, waiting for its next occupant. The year was 1879, and Red Creek was a blister on the face of the desert. Life here was cheap, and survival was a full-time job. For Clara Benson, all of 23 years old, survival had become a bitter pill she swallowed every single morning. Her husband, a man who lived and died by the gun, had taken a bullet in a dusty street over a card game, leaving Clara with nothing but his name and a hole in her heart. Since then, her days were a blur of scrubbing floors, washing the laundry of strangers, and serving whiskey to cowboys who looked right through her. Her hands were rough, her dress was worn, but in her eyes there was a fire that hadn't gone out. Not yet. She was a survivor, and she swore to herself every single day that she would not break. One night the saloon was alive with the usual noise of cheap piano music and loud laughter. Clara moved through the crowd, her face a blank mask, when she felt a pair of eyes on her. It wasn't the usual leering gaze of a drunken cowboy. This was different. It was cold, calculating, and heavy. The gaze belonged to Jeremiah Rollins. At 71, Jeremiah was less a man and more a monument carved from the harsh desert landscape itself. His land stretched farther than any man could ride in a day, his cattle numbered in the thousands, and his power was absolute. They called him the King of Red Creek, a title spoken in hushed, fearful tones. He'd had 5 wives. 2 died in childbirth, they said. The other 3, well, the other 3 had simply vanished. People didn't ask questions about Jeremiah Rollins. He watched Clara all night. He saw the grief in her eyes, but he also saw the steel spine holding her up. He saw a survivor. And Jeremiah Rollins collected beautiful things that survived. A few days later, he found her by the town well. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He looked at her worn dress, her calloused hands, and he asked her to be his 6th wife. The town exploded with gossip. Some said he was a saint, saving a poor widow. Others whispered she was a witch, that she'd cast a spell on the old man. But the men who worked for Jeremiah, they didn't say much at all. Elias Kane, his head foreman, a man with eyes like chips of ice, just stared at Clara with a look that wasn't suspicion, but something closer to appraisal, like he was measuring a coffin. Tomas Herrera, the superstitious Mexican foreman, just crossed himself and looked away. And young Silas Boone, ambitious and cunning, he just smiled, a hungry look in his eyes, as if he could already see how this new piece on the chessboard would change the game. Clara didn't care what they thought. She saw a lifeline. She saw soft beds and warm meals. She saw an end to her struggle. It wasn't a choice made from love, but from the cold, hard logic of survival. She said yes. The wedding was a quick, quiet affair. A few of the ranch hands snickered behind their hands, placing bets on how long the pretty young thing would last. They thought they were betting on a marriage. What they didn't know was that they were betting on her life. That first night in the massive stone mansion that was now her home, Clara expected a frail old man. She was wrong. There was a surprising raw energy in Jeremiah, a fire that hadn't burned out. He wasn't cruel, but he was possessive. His touch felt less like an embrace and more like a brand. And in his eyes she saw the same look he gave his prize horses, his sprawling land, the look of ownership. For 7 days Clara lived in a dream. Jeremiah showered her with gifts, dresses of silk from New Orleans, jewels that glittered on her skin. He called her his queen and promised her the world. A strange, cautious affection began to grow in her heart. He was a lonely old man, she told herself. He just wanted a companion. She started to believe she could be happy. She started to believe she was safe. But this was Red Creek, and safety was a lie. The mansion was vast, but it felt suffocating. There were whispers in the halls that stopped when she entered a room. There were locked drawers in Jeremiah's study, and there was one door at the end of a long, dark hallway that was always locked, a heavy oak door with a massive iron lock. Jeremiah had told her, his voice uncharacteristically hard, that the room was never to be opened. It held old sorrows, he said, best to leave them buried. The looks from the foreman grew stranger. Elias Kane watched her constantly, his cold gaze following her everywhere. He wasn't just a foreman, he was a guard dog, and she was beginning to feel like a prisoner. Thomas Herrera would flinch if she came near him, muttering prayers under his breath. He looked at her like she was already a ghost. And Silas Boone, he was the worst. He'd approach her with a slick, false kindness, his eyes full of questions he never asked out loud. He was a vulture, circling, waiting for the king to fall so he could pick at the corpse of his empire. Clara felt a creeping dread coil in her stomach. Her golden cage was beginning to feel less like a palace and more like a trap. She started to realize that Jeremiah Rollins wasn't just hiding bitter memories. He was hiding something monstrous, and she was sleeping next to it every single night. The dream was turning into a nightmare, and she was starting to think she might never wake up. The unease gnawed at her, a constant low hum beneath the surface of her new, luxurious life. She would catch Elias Kane polishing a set of ornate silver spurs in the courtyard, his eyes fixed on her as she walked by the window. The message was clear, unspoken, but sharp as the spurs themselves. You are on the Rollins Ranch now. You follow Rollins' rules. One afternoon she found Tomas Herrera near the stables, carving a small wooden figure. When he saw her, he dropped it as if it had burned him, his face paling. He scooped it up and hurried away, but not before she saw what it was. A small, crude depiction of a woman, bound in ropes. He wasn't superstitious because of ghosts. He was superstitious because he knew what happened to the women in this house. He was carving a ward, not against spirits, but against a living monster. Her attempts to feel out an ally were met with a wall of fear. The servants would lower their eyes. The other ranch hands would suddenly find urgent work to do elsewhere. She was an island, surrounded by a sea of silent, terrified people who all knew a secret she didn't. But it was Silas Boone who truly set her teeth on edge. He found her in the garden one morning, a charming smile on his face. "Mrs. Rollins," he'd said, his voice smooth as silk, "the desert sun suits you. You bloom like a rare cactus flower." The compliment felt like an insult. His eyes weren't looking at her. They were assessing her like a gambler sizing up a poker hand. He was trying to figure out her value, her weakness. He was playing a long game, and she was a pawn he was trying to understand before he made his move. That night, she couldn't sleep. The silence of the mansion was deafening. She found herself wandering the halls, a ghost in her own home, drawn again and again to that forbidden door. She ran her fingers over the cold iron of the lock. What sorrows could be so terrible they needed to be locked away like this? What was he so desperate to hide? A faint, cloying smell seemed to emanate from beneath the door. It was sweet, but with a rotten undertone, like flowers left too long on a grave. The smell of decay. Her gratitude for Jeremiah was curdling into suspicion, her affection into fear. Every night when he came to their bed, his touch felt different. The possessiveness she'd first noticed was now a palpable threat. She'd lie there, rigid as he slept, listening to his heavy breathing and wondering what horrors his mind held. She started looking for keys, sifting through his things when he was out on the range. In a small, locked box in his desk, she found a collection of letters. They were from the families of his previous wives, desperate, pleading letters at first, asking for news, then angry letters, demanding to know where their daughters had gone. The last letter in each pile was the same, a short, curt note from Jeremiah, stating that his wife had left him, and he did not know her whereabouts. He had enclosed a large sum of money with each note. Hush money. He hadn't just lost his wives, he had erased them. One night a brutal sandstorm descended on Red Creek, the wind howling like a banshee. The noise rattled the very bones of the house. Clara awoke with a jolt, her heart pounding. The space beside her in the bed was empty. Jeremiah was gone. A cold dread, sharper and more intense than ever before, washed over her. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. A sliver of light glowed from under the door of their room. But it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from downstairs. She crept to the door and peered through the keyhole. She could see the grand staircase, and at the bottom a single flickering light. It was Jeremiah, holding an oil lamp, his back to her. He was walking slowly, deliberately, down the dark hallway, the hallway that led to the forbidden door. Her breath caught in her throat. He was going to the room. He was going to uncover his sorrows, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow that she had to see what they were. She had to know the truth, because she was starting to suspect that his sorrows were buried 6 feet deep. Clara moved like a phantom down the grand staircase, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The storm outside raged, a perfect symphony for the terror unfolding within. She reached the bottom and pressed herself into the shadows of a large tapestry, her eyes glued to the end of the hall. Jeremiah stood before the forbidden oak door. The lamplight cast his shadow long and grotesque against the wall, making him look like a hunched ghoul guarding a crypt. He fumbled with a heavy brass key, his old hands trembling. The sound of the key scraping into the massive iron lock was unnervingly loud, a screech that cut through the howl of the wind. With a heavy, groaning creak, the door swung inward, revealing not just a room, but a maw of absolute darkness. Jeremiah stepped inside, and the light from his lamp was swallowed by the shadows. The door remained ajar. Clara waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Her mind screamed at her to run, to go back to bed and pretend she'd seen nothing. But her feet were rooted to the spot. A force stronger than fear, the desperate need to know, pulled her forward. She crept down the hallway, her every sense on high alert. The strange, cloying smell was stronger here, thick and suffocating. Dust, dried herbs, and something else, something metallic and foul. She reached the doorway and hesitated, her hand trembling as she rested it on the cold wood. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she peered inside. The room was a shrine, a museum of the dead. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light of the single lamp Jeremiah held. On the far wall, hung in a neat, orderly row, were 5 portraits, 5 beautiful young women, their smiles frozen for eternity. And as Clara's gaze moved from one face to the next, a strangled gasp escaped her lips. They all looked like her. The same dark hair, the same shape of the eyes, the same delicate line of the jaw. He hadn't chosen her by chance. He had chosen her because she was a replacement, a replica of what he had lost, or what he had taken. On a long table beneath the portraits, personal effects were laid out with meticulous care. A faded silk dress, a silver locket, a worn, leather-bound book of poetry, relics from 5 stolen lives. It was a monument to his obsession. Jeremiah stood in the center of the room, his back to her. He hadn't noticed her. His attention was fixed on a large, dark wooden chest that sat on the floor like a sarcophagus. He knelt before it, his movements slow and ritualistic, like a priest at an altar. He ran his gnarled fingers over the polished wood before his hands moved to the heavy lid. A primal wave of nausea rose in Clara's throat. She knew what was in that chest, but her mind refused to accept it. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was paralyzed, a helpless witness to this profane ceremony. With a low groan, Jeremiah lifted the lid. He reached inside and pulled something out. He held it up to the lamplight, and Clara saw it. A human skull, small and delicate. He cradled it in his hands, a look of twisted, sorrowful adoration on his face. Then he turned. He finally saw her standing in the doorway, her face a mask of pure horror. But there was no surprise in his eyes, no shock, only a deep, ancient sadness. It was as if he had been expecting her. His voice, when he spoke, was a dry, rasping whisper that barely carried over the storm. "They wanted to leave me," he murmured, his gaze distant, looking through her at the ghosts only he could see. "They all promised forever, but they tried to leave." He looked down at the skull in his hands, a horrifying tenderness in his expression. "I couldn't let them go, Clara. I couldn't bear to be alone again, so I kept them. I keep them all safe, here, with me, forever." The world tilted on its axis. The man she had started to feel affection for, the man who had saved her from poverty, was a monster, a collector of wives. The portraits weren't memories, they were a catalogue. The chest wasn't for storage, it was a mass grave. In that instant, the fragile bond she had felt with him shattered into a million pieces, replaced by a cold, visceral revulsion. Jeremiah Rollins wasn't just a lonely old man. He was a tomb, and he had just shown her the empty plot he had reserved for her. The next few days were a waking nightmare. Clara moved through the mansion in a fog of managed terror, a perfect actress playing the part of the devoted wife. She smiled at Jeremiah over breakfast, her stomach churning at the sight of him. She allowed him to touch her, her skin crawling with a revulsion so profound it was a physical pain. She was living in a mausoleum, sleeping next to the curator. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner, was a reminder of the 5 women who had walked these halls before her. The 5 women now resting in pieces in a wooden box. She was no longer a wife. She was a death row inmate, counting the days until her own portrait would hang on that morbid wall. But Jeremiah was no fool. He had lived a long life reading the tales of men and animals. He saw the new stillness in her, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. He felt the subtle stiffening in her body when he touched her. He recognized the look. It was the same look the others had gotten right before they made their mistake, right before they tried to run. And the fear of being abandoned again, that deep, festering wound at the core of his monstrous soul, began to change him. The quiet possessiveness became a suffocating obsession. The ranch transformed from a gilded cage into a high-security prison. He started locking their bedroom door from the outside when he left for the day. He instructed Elias Kane to never let her out of his sight. The foreman's icy gaze was now a constant presence, a silent promise of violence if she stepped out of line. He was Jeremiah's enforcer, and Clara knew with sickening certainty that Elias was the one who had likely helped Jeremiah keep his previous wives. One afternoon, Elias cornered her in the hallway, blocking her path. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled a small, tarnished silver locket from his pocket. He let it swing from its chain, back and forth, like a hypnotist's watch. It was the same locket she had seen on the table in the forbidden room. Then he smiled, a cold, cruel slash of a smile, and put it away. It was a warning. "We know you know, and we know what happens to wives who know." Tomas Herrera now avoided her completely, scurrying away like a frightened mouse if their paths crossed. His fear was so palpable it was almost a stench. He knew his boss was a murderer, and he was terrified of being caught in the crossfire. He offered no hope of help. He was a prisoner too, trapped by his fear. Her last desperate hope was Silas Boone. His ambition was his defining trait. Perhaps, she thought, she could use it. Perhaps he hated Jeremiah enough to help her escape, in the hopes of taking his place. She sought him out by the corral, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and terror. She kept her voice low, her words vague but pointed. She spoke of feeling trapped, of wanting a different life. She watched his face, searching for any flicker of sympathy, of alliance. Silas listened patiently, a thoughtful expression on his face. He even placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Rollins," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I understand completely. A woman like you deserves her freedom. Let me think on it. Let me see what can be done." For a single fleeting moment, a spark of hope ignited in Clara's chest. She had an ally. She wasn't alone. The hope was extinguished that very evening. Jeremiah summoned her to his study. The moment she walked in, she saw Silas Boone standing by the fireplace, a smug, triumphant look on his face. Her blood ran cold. It had been a test, a trap, and she had walked right into it. "Silas tells me you're unhappy, Clara," Jeremiah said, his voice deceptively calm. He stood up and walked toward her. His eyes were not the eyes of a sad, lonely old man. They were the flat, dead eyes of a predator. "He tells me you're thinking of leaving." He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath. He reached out and stroked her cheek with the back of his gnarled hand. His touch was like ice. "I believe I told you," he whispered, "that I don't let my wives leave, but perhaps you need a more visual reminder of our arrangement." He gestured to the wall where a new empty picture frame now hung. It was identical to the ones in the forbidden room. "I've already commissioned the artist," he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "He'll be here in a month. I do hope you'll sit still for him." In that moment, Clara understood. There was no escape, no ally, no hope. They were all part of his monstrous world. Elias, the enforcer; Silas, the opportunist; Thomas, the terrified witness. She had only two choices left: a slow, inevitable death that would end with her bones in a box, or a faster, more violent one of her own making. The path forward was no longer about escape. It was about survival, and survival required a sacrifice. The King of Red Creek had just signed his own death warrant. The next week was a master class in deception. Clara became the perfect wife. She was docile, attentive, almost affectionate. She learned to silence the screaming in her own mind and project an aura of defeated acceptance. She needed Jeremiah to lower his guard. She needed him to believe he had finally broken her, just like he had broken all the others. Every action was calculated. She would ask Jeremiah about his day, listening to his stories of the ranch, all the while mapping the layout of the house in her head, noting the routines of the guards, the moments when she was least observed. She found her weapon in a dusty trunk in the attic, a place the servants rarely went. It was her first husband's old Bowie knife, a brutal piece of steel she had kept for the memories she now despised. She cleaned it, sharpened it on a whetstone until the edge was razor-sharp, and hid it beneath a loose floorboard in her wardrobe. It felt heavy in her hand, a cold, terrible promise of what was to come. She knew she couldn't just run. Even if she killed him, Elias Kane would be on her like a wolf. He was fiercely loyal, and his brand of justice would be swift and brutal. She needed a plan that accounted for him, for all of them. She needed chaos. She needed a diversion, and the desert itself would provide it. She began watching the sky, studying the weather patterns. She knew the signs of an impending sandstorm, the strange stillness in the air, the yellowish tinge to the horizon. She would need its cover. Its blinding, howling fury would be her only ally. She also needed a horse, the best and fastest on the ranch. She spent afternoons in the stables, under the watchful eye of whichever ranch hand was on duty, pretending to have taken a sudden interest in the animals. She fed them sugar cubes, spoke to them softly, but her eyes were assessing them. She chose a black mare named Hecate, a powerful, spirited animal that seemed to have a spark of wildness in her eyes. Clara slowly gained the horse's trust, a secret alliance forming between two captive creatures. The tension in the house was unbearable. Silas Boone would watch her with a smug, knowing look, convinced he had secured his place as Jeremiah's heir. Elias Kane's vigilance never wavered, his cold eyes a constant weight on her. But Jeremiah, he started to relax. He saw her obedience, her apparent submission, and his monstrous ego was satisfied. He believed his threat had worked. He believed she was now just another one of his beautiful, broken possessions. He grew complacent, and that was the mistake she had been counting on. On the seventh night after her death sentence had been issued, the air grew heavy and still. The sky turned a sickly shade of ochre. The storm was coming. Clara knew this was her chance, her only chance. She dressed for dinner in a fine silk gown, one of Jeremiah's gifts, playing her part to the very end. She ate, she smiled, she spoke when spoken to, her mind a cold, calm sea of murderous intent. Later that night, in their bedroom, Jeremiah was drinking heavily, celebrating his victory over her spirit. He was clumsy, his words slurred, but his eyes still held that chilling, possessive gleam. "You see, my dear," he mumbled, reaching for her, "isn't it so much easier when you accept your place? You are mine, forever." He grabbed her, his grip sloppy but strong, pulling her toward the bed. This was it. The wind began to howl outside, the first grains of sand rattling against the window pane. It was time. "You're right, Jeremiah," she said, her voice a soft whisper. She reached up as if to embrace him, her fingers tracing a line along his jaw. It was a gesture of submission, of affection. It was a lie. Her other hand, hidden in the folds of her dress, was wrapped tightly around the hilt of the Bowie knife. As he leaned in to kiss her, his eyes clouded with whiskey and triumph, she moved. In one single fluid motion, born of pure, unadulterated will to survive, she drove the knife upward, plunging it deep into his throat, just under his chin. She put all of her weight, all of her rage, all of her terror into that one perfect strike. Jeremiah's eyes flew wide open, a look of profound, sputtering shock replacing his smugness. He made a gurgling sound, a wet, choked gasp, as his lifeblood erupted from the wound, hot and thick, covering her hands. He stumbled backward, clawing at his throat. But it was useless. The king of Red Creek, the monster who collected wives, drowned in his own blood on the expensive Persian rug, his dead eyes staring up at the woman who had refused to be part of his collection. Clara did not hesitate. There was no time for remorse, no time for anything but the plan. She wiped the blade on the bed sheets, then moved to the window. The storm was now a raging tempest, a wall of sand and fury. Perfect. She had already unlocked the window latch earlier in the day. She slipped out onto the narrow stone ledge, the wind tearing at her, threatening to rip her from her perch. She moved carefully along the ledge to the thick ivy that grew up the side of the mansion wall, a treacherous ladder she had studied for days. Her silk dress tore, the stones scraped her hands, but she didn't feel it. Adrenaline was a fire in her veins. She reached the ground and ran, a ghost in the swirling sand, toward the stables. Inside, the horses were panicked by the storm. She went straight to Hecate's stall, saddling the mare with practiced, efficient movements. As she led the horse out, a lantern flared to life at the far end of the stable. It was Elias Kane. He had heard the commotion. His face was a mask of cold fury, a pistol already in his hand. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Rawlins?" he snarled. Clara didn't answer. She swung herself onto Hecate's back, kicking the horse into a desperate gallop. A shot rang out, the bullet whining past her ear, close enough to feel its heat. She didn't look back. She rode straight into the heart of the storm, into the blinding, screaming chaos of the desert night. Elias Kane would follow. She knew that. He was a wolf, and he was the best tracker in the territory. But tonight, the desert itself was her accomplice. The storm would cover her tracks, hide her from sight. She was just a speck of dust in an ocean of it, a vengeful spirit escaping a house of ghosts. She rode on, the rhythmic thunder of hooves her only heartbeat, a desperate prayer for a dawn she might not live to see. The sandstorm was a living entity, a roaring beast of wind and grit that scoured the world clean. It was her shield and her tormentor. Clara rode blindly, trusting Hecate to keep her footing, her face wrapped in a piece of torn silk from her dress. She could see nothing, hear nothing but the howl of the wind. She knew Elias was back there somewhere, a relentless hunter who knew this desert better than his own soul. But the storm was the great equalizer. It made all men blind. She didn't ride in a straight line. She remembered the canyons and arroyos from her rides with Jeremiah, the mental map she had painstakingly built. She pushed Hecate through a narrow, rocky passage, the horse's hooves striking sparks in the dark. The wind was slightly less punishing here, and it would make her trail harder to find, even for a tracker like Cain. She rode for what felt like an eternity, her body screaming in protest, until the first hint of dawn began to bleed through the thinning storm. The wind died down to a whisper, leaving behind a world transformed, a landscape of smooth, windswept dunes. The Rowlands ranch was lost somewhere behind her, a bad dream swallowed by the horizon. She had made it through the night, but she wasn't safe yet. She found a small, hidden spring, letting Hecate drink while she kept watch, scanning the horizon. There was nothing, no sign of pursuit. Had the storm been enough? Had Elias given up? She knew better. Men like Cain didn't give up. He would be circling, casting for a sign, a broken branch, a misplaced stone. She couldn't rest. She mounted up and kept moving, heading south, toward the territories where a woman on her own might just disappear. For days, she lived like a hunted animal. She traveled at night, rested during the brutal heat of the day in whatever shade she could find. She ate the few provisions she'd managed to grab and drank sparingly from her canteen. Every shadow looked like a man on horseback. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing gallop. The ghost of Jeremiah Rollins was gone, but the ghost of Elias Kane haunted her every step. One evening, crouched behind a rock formation, she saw him, a lone rider in the distance, moving with a slow, patient certainty. It was him. He hadn't lost her trail. He had just been waiting, letting her think she was safe, letting her make a mistake. Her heart seized with ice-cold fear. He was closing the gap. Running was no longer an option. He would wear her down, run her horse into the ground. It had to end here. Her mind raced, sifting through the desperate options. Her only weapon was the knife, and she stood no chance against his gun in a direct fight. She had to use the terrain. She had to use his own arrogance against him. She led him into a narrow box canyon, a dead end she had spotted earlier. It was a terrible risk, a trap for her as much as for him. She dismounted, hiding Hecate behind a jumble of rocks. Then she climbed, her fingers and toes finding purchase on the steep canyon wall until she was perched on a narrow ledge about 20 feet above the canyon floor. And then she waited. An hour later, he rode in. Elias Kane entered the canyon slowly, his pistol drawn, his cold eyes scanning every shadow. He saw the tracks ended. He saw Hecate partially hidden. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He thought he had her cornered. "It's over, Clara," he called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "The old man wanted you back, but I think he'd be just as happy if I just brought back the jewels." He dismounted, walking forward, confident, savoring his victory. He was looking at the rocks where the horse was hidden, expecting her to be cowering there. He never looked up. That was his mistake. As he passed directly beneath her ledge, Clara pushed off with all her might, the bowie knife clutched in her hand. She landed on his back, a silent, deadly weight. The impact drove them both to the ground. His gun went flying. He was strong, wiry, and tough as leather, and he thrashed wildly, trying to throw her off. But Clara was fueled by a primal fury, the accumulated rage of her captivity, the terror of the hunt. She was no longer a frightened widow. She was an angel of vengeance. She plunged the knife into his back, once, twice, again and again, until he stopped moving. She lay there for a long time, panting, on top of the man who had been her jailer, the desert sun beating down on them both. It was finally over. The king was dead. His most loyal knight was dead. The ghosts of Red Creek had finally been silenced. She took his gun, his water, and his horse, leaving him for the vultures. She never looked back. Clara Benson ceased to exist that day. She took a new name in a new town, melting into the vast, anonymous tapestry of the West. The story of the Rawlins Ranch became a whispered legend, a ghost story told around campfires. They said the old man's young wife had been stolen by spirits, that the whole ranch was cursed. They found Jeremiah's body, but Elias Kane was never seen again, just another man swallowed by the desert. No one ever knew the truth. No one ever knew that the quiet seamstress in dusty San Saba, the woman with the haunted eyes and the hands that were never quite still, was the queen who had toppled a kingdom of horrors to win her freedom. Her escape from that gilded cage wasn't just about breaking the bars. It was about slaying the monster who held the key and the guard who watched the door. Her story is a stark reminder that sometimes the only path to justice is the one you carve yourself, with desperation and a blade. What would you have done in Clara's place? Faced with a monstrous truth and no hope of escape, would you have chosen her path? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that some stories are too important to be forgotten, make sure you subscribe to Wanted Stories and hit that like button. Click the video on your screen right now for another tale pulled from the shadows of history. Until next time, keep listening to the whispers of the past. They have more to tell than you could ever imagine.